The moment that changed everything happened not on a battlefield, not in a courtroom, not inside the United Nations. It happened in a closed room in Ankara, Turkey, where one man looked at a map of the Middle East, looked at the economic numbers sitting in front of him, and made a calculation so precise, so cold, and so devastating for Israel that the people who found out about it first went completely silent. That man is Recep Tayyip Erdogan, and what he just set into motion is not a speech. It is not a protest. It is not another round of diplomatic statements that disappear in 48 hours. What Erdogan has activated is a three-layer economic, military, and diplomatic stranglehold that Israel's own analysts are now privately calling the most dangerous trap Israel has ever walked into. And almost nobody in the Western media is connecting the dots. Today, we are going to connect every single one.
Here is what most people do not understand about Turkey. Every other country that has moved against Israel in the past 2 years has done so from a position of weakness, desperation, or ideology. Iran is under sanctions. Pakistan is drowning in debt. The Arab League is fractured. South Africa brought a legal case, but has no military weight. Turkey is none of those things. Turkey has the second largest military in NATO. It has 355,000 active duty soldiers. It controls the Bosphorus Strait, the only naval passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, meaning it holds a geographic veto over Russian naval movement that makes Washington deeply dependent on Ankara's goodwill. Its economy, despite inflation problems, is the 17th largest in the world and growing. It is a member of the G20. It sits at the intersection of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East in a way that no other single country does. And unlike Iran, Turkey cannot be sanctioned. Unlike Pakistan, Turkey cannot be pressured through IMF loans. Unlike the Arab Gulf states, Turkey does not need American military protection to survive. Erdogan knows exactly what he has, and he has been waiting for the right moment to use it.
To understand what Erdogan is doing right now, you have to go back to 2010. May 31st, 2010. The Mavi Marmara flotilla, a Turkish civilian ship carrying humanitarian aid to Gaza, was boarded by Israeli commandos in international waters. 10 Turkish citizens were killed. One of them was also an American citizen. What happened next is the part that rewired Erdogan's entire calculation about Israel. The Israeli government not only refused to apologize, it initially defended the raid. The relationship between Turkey and Israel, which had been one of the warmest in the Muslim world for decades, joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, tourism deals worth billions, collapsed overnight.
For years, analysts said it was just a diplomatic freeze, that Erdogan was playing to his domestic base, that the relationship would recover because both countries needed each other economically. And for a while, that looked partly true. Trade between Turkey and Israel actually continued growing quietly, even as the political relationship stayed cold. But here is what nobody was saying out loud. Erdogan was not letting go. He was learning. He was studying exactly where Israel's dependencies were, exactly which economic arteries ran through Turkish territory or Turkish-controlled airspace, exactly which diplomatic forums Turkey could use to isolate Israel without triggering American military retaliation. He was building a map. And what is happening right now is that map being activated.
Let us talk about the 3 specific moves that are happening right now, because this is where the story becomes extraordinary. Weapon 1, trade suspension. Turkey officially suspended all trade with Israel in May 2024. The numbers behind that decision are staggering. Before the suspension, Turkey was one of Israel's top 5 trading partners. Bilateral trade had reached nearly $7 billion annually. Turkish steel, Turkish construction materials, Turkish textiles, all of it flowing into Israel and helping to sustain industries that the Israeli economy depends on. That flow is now completely cut, and Israel has been unable to replace those supply chains because the countries it would normally turn to are watching what Turkey does before deciding their own positions.
Weapon 2. Airspace. Turkey controls some of the most critical airspace in the eastern Mediterranean. Israeli civilian and cargo flights that used to transit through Turkish-controlled corridors have been rerouted at enormous cost. But the more significant dimension of the airspace issue is military. Israeli Air Force operations in the northern theater, any potential strike route toward Iran that goes through the north, passes dangerously close to Turkish radar coverage and Turkish air defense systems. Erdogan has made it unmistakably clear that Turkish airspace is closed. That changes the geometry of Israeli military planning in ways that Israeli defense strategists are still working through. Weapon 3. The diplomatic multiplier. This is the one that keeps people in Washington awake at night. Turkey holds enormous influence inside NATO, inside the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, inside the UN General Assembly, and across the Balkans, Central Asia, and North Africa. When Turkey speaks in those forums, it does not just cast its own vote, it moves votes. Countries that would never challenge Washington directly on Israel are now being quietly given permission and political cover to move by Ankara. The coordinated legal campaign at the International Criminal Court, the votes at the UN General Assembly, the growing list of countries downgrading or suspending diplomatic relations with Israel, Turkey's fingerprints are on almost all of it, even when its name does not appear in the headline.
Here is the detail that should make every single person watching this stop and think carefully. Turkey is a NATO member. Israel is not. And Erdogan has started using that asymmetry in a way that is brilliant in its simplicity. Inside NATO consultations, the ones that happen behind closed doors, away from press conferences, Turkey has been raising the question of whether the alliance's collective resources, its intelligence sharing networks, its joint military planning mechanisms, its political umbrella, are being used in ways that serve Turkey's national interests or contradict them. That is an extremely polite way of saying, if you want Turkey's continued cooperation inside NATO, you need to account for what your non-NATO ally Israel is doing to a region Turkey considers its strategic backyard.
The Americans understand this pressure. European NATO members understand it even more acutely because they are the ones dealing with the refugee and political fallout from the conflict in their own domestic politics. And what it means in practice is that Israel, which has always relied on the fact that its closest ally is the leader of the world's most powerful military alliance, is now watching that same alliance develop internal fractures directly because of its actions. Erdogan is not threatening to leave NATO. He does not need to. He is simply making it clear that Turkish cooperation inside the alliance has a price. And that price includes treating Turkey as a real geopolitical equal, whose concerns about Palestine and about Israeli military conduct are legitimate, not dismissible. Israel has no answer for this, because the move does not require a single soldier to be deployed. Publicly, the Israeli government has responded to Erdogan with the same dismissive language it uses for every country that challenges it. Senior officials have called Turkey's statements political theater. They have accused Erdogan of using Palestine to distract from Turkey's own domestic problems. One official called Turkey a country that trades with Hamas while lecturing Israel about morality. But privately, the response is completely different. Israeli intelligence has significantly upgraded its Turkey monitoring operation. Resources that were previously focused almost entirely on Iran, Hezbollah, and the Palestinian territories have been redirected toward understanding Turkey's diplomatic communications and its military positioning in the eastern Mediterranean and in Syria, where Turkey and Israel have competing interests and have already had near confrontations that were kept out of the press. More significantly, Israel has been quietly lobbying Washington to pressure Ankara into backing down. Those lobbying efforts have largely failed, and they have failed for a reason that cuts to the heart of how dramatically the geopolitical landscape has shifted. Washington needs Turkey more right now than it has in a decade. Russia's war in Ukraine made Turkey's control of the Bosphorus strategically critical.
Turkey's role in managing refugee flows into Europe gives Ankara enormous leverage over European political stability. And the American military base at Incirlik in southern Turkey remains one of the most important forward operating positions in the entire region. In other words, the one country that Israel has always counted on to bring other countries into line, the United States, is currently in a position where it cannot afford to put serious pressure on Erdogan. And Erdogan knows this perfectly.
Let us talk about money, because money is where abstract geopolitics becomes real and unavoidable. Since Turkey's trade suspension, Israel has lost access to approximately $7 billion in annual bilateral trade. But the secondary effects are larger. Turkish companies had joint ventures with Israeli partners across technology, construction, and agriculture. Those relationships have unwound. The Israeli construction sector, which was already under pressure from the war, has faced material shortages that trace directly back to the Turkish suspension. At the same time, Turkey has been deepening its economic relationships with countries that are simultaneously reducing their exposure to Israel. The practical effect is a kind of economic encirclement, not dramatic enough to make news on any single day, but accumulating steadily in ways that Israeli economic planners are watching with growing alarm. And here is the number that matters most. Turkey's economy, for all of its inflation problems, represents a market of 85 million people, with a growing middle class and ambitions to become a top 10 global economy by 2050. When Turkey positions itself as the economic and diplomatic anchor of a new Muslim-majority trading and political bloc, one that explicitly excludes countries that maintain unconditional support for Israel, the countries being asked to choose sides are doing the math. And increasingly, the math is favoring Ankara.
Here is what we are watching for right now, because this story is moving fast. Inside the United Nations, Turkey has been coordinating with a group of countries on a resolution that goes further than anything the General Assembly has passed before, not just condemning Israeli operations, but explicitly calling for member states to take concrete economic and diplomatic measures. The language being drafted is specific. It names mechanisms, it sets timelines, and it has enough guaranteed votes to pass regardless of an American veto in the Security Council, because General Assembly resolutions do not require Security Council approval. At the same time, we are watching Turkey's naval positioning in the Eastern Mediterranean very closely. Turkey has been conducting what it describes as routine naval exercises, but the frequency, the scale, and the geographic positioning of those exercises have changed in ways that Israeli naval planners cannot ignore. No shots have been fired, no confrontation has occurred, but the message is written in the positioning of ships and the flight paths of surveillance drones, and it is being read clearly in Tel Aviv. And inside the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Turkey is pushing for the strongest collective statement in that body's history, one that would commit member states to a coordinated and binding set of actions rather than the symbolic declarations the organization has become known for. We are, right now, at the edge of something historic. Whether it tips into a genuine new chapter or gets pulled back from the brink by last-minute diplomacy is the question that will define the next 30 days. Here is where we are. Turkey, a NATO member with the second largest military in the alliance, control over critical airspace and sea passages, $7 billion in suspended trade, and growing diplomatic leadership across 3 continents, has placed Israel in a position it has genuinely never been in before. Not through missiles, not through terrorism, through strategy, patience, and the careful use of every lever of power that a major regional state possesses. Erdogan waited 14 years after the Mavi Marmara. He studied, he prepared, and now he is moving. At the exact moment when Israel is most isolated, most legally exposed, and most dependent on American cover that the Americans themselves are finding harder and harder to provide. This is not the end of the story. It is the chapter where the story finally gets real. We are going to be here for every development, every vote, every naval movement, every diplomatic shift, every moment that the mainstream media refuses to report honestly. Subscribe now if you are not already part of this community, because what comes next is going to move faster than almost anyone is predicting. Now I want to hear directly from you. Here is my question for the comments. Do you believe Erdogan's pressure on Israel is part of a genuine long-term strategy to reshape the Middle East? Or is this still political performance for his domestic audience? Drop your honest answer below. I read every single one personally.